C.L. Werner.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody that's attending. And hopefully I can make this interesting for you guys.
Of that, I have no doubt. So, given the nature of this little convention and of so much of your work, I'd be remiss if we didn't start with the obvious question. What got you interested in sword and sorcery? Where did it all begin for you?
Well, I think for everybody, it always starts back with Robert E. Howard. And my first encounter with Robert E. Howard was an old Marvel comic book called Supernatural Thrillers. And it was the second or third issue of that magazine that they did an adaptation of Valley of the Worm. And that was kind of what set everything off. Prior to that, I maybe had some awareness of Conan, but that was my first true experience of sword and sorcery.
And where did things go from there?
Well, Robert E. Howard, I mean, up until that point, I'd been reading people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, J.R.R. Tolkien, and, Robert E. Howard's writing style has a deceptive ease to it. It's very approachable, makes you think, oh, I can do that. Of course, when you start to try to do that, you find out how deceptive his prose is because, yeah, he might only use 2 sentences to describe an entire city, but damn if that man didn't know exactly which words he needed to use. So, whereas, say, Tolkien would spend page after page just describing a few trees, Robert E. Howard really had it nailed down as far as sort of the being terse with his prose. He knew what words to use and how to employ them. But that's better or worse, he is what made me think, oh, I can do this.
Hey, Sean, I'm sorry to ask, when you're not speaking, do you mind muting yourself? Because there's a little bit of reverb that's happening. I'm not sure if I'm the only one picking that up, but I do hear a little bit of reverb from your end.
No, I can hear it too.
Well, Robert E. Howard's always the place to start. So I guess from there, when did you make the leap into starting to write fiction?
Well, after banging my head on the wall for over a decade, I finally got some professional credits through Black Library, which is Games Workshop's kind of literary arm. And back in the 90s, early 2000s, they used to publish a magazine called Inferno, and they had open submissions to Inferno. So I sent Mark Gascon, who was the editor at the time, sent him a short story that ended up growing into the first Matthias Thulman tale. So that was kind of what got the whole ball rolling. And after Thulman, I started writing Werner, and from there, advanced into different novels for them. So very much started with Inferno.
So what was it that drew you to Warhammer and Warhammer 40K, first of all? I mean, speaking as somebody who's never played either game, I have to admit, from the outside looking in, it's a pretty intimidating looking world, yet you dove in like a duck to water, or I guess a space marine to a battle.
Well, I'm more into the fantasy side of Warhammer than I am with 40K. I think I'm five editions behind at this point with 40K. But what drew me into Warhammer Fantasy was a advertisement that was in Dragon magazine back in the day, and it was like a 4-page color spread that had a prose story attached to it that was about a imprisoned cultist who gets taken away by the Skaven, and it just really fired the imagination the way that it was written. So I realized I kind of owe it all to the Skaven in a sick sort of way. They just struck me as so unique from all the other fantasy that I'd been reading at that point. Dragonlance novels, Tolkien again, even Sword and Sorcery with Robert E. Howard. Just the whole take on the Skaven and the idea of chaos almost as a physical and spiritual corruption. The way that they used to approach it anyway was almost like a radiation sickness, except something that also seeped into your soul. So even somebody with the best of intentions is going to get corrupted by this sort of contagion.
And you've created some of the more memorable heroes in the Warhammer setting that you've played around with. Werner, Thulman. What were some of the inspirations behind them, motivations, creation behind those characters? And did you ever think they'd take off the way they did?
Well, I think anytime you create a character, you're really hoping that they take off. Thulman in particular was kind of a mashup of the historical Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, and obviously Solomon Kane. My approach was, well, historically Hopkins was a charlatan and a murderer, but what if the witches were real? You know, all of a sudden that flips everything on its head. So that was kind of the approach that I took with Thulman. Brunner owes a lot more to, I guess, a childhood spent with too many spaghetti westerns and the bad influences of my father. Surprisingly enough, he doesn't owe very much to Clint Eastwood. I had more sort of Lee Van Cleef or Klaus Kinski in mind with that. One of the huge influences, though, is a sadly obscure movie called El Diablo with Louis Gossett Jr. playing a very underhanded gunslinger named Thomas Van Leek. I mean, one of his favorite lines in there is, you shot him in the back. Well, his back was to me. And that kind of epitomized sort of Brunner's attitude. Whatever it takes to win, he's not going to screw around with anything, just get the job done. So, yeah, I'd say really owes a lot to spaghetti westerns and some of the sort of neo spaghetti westerns that followed.
Well, I could gleefully ask you a dozen questions about westerns right now, but I think the Warhammer Sandbox.
Hey, Sean, real quick too. I don't know if you're keeping an eye on the chat box, but there's questions that are coming in too that we might want to organically kind of work into things while they're on topic. I don't know if we're gonna circle back around, but it might be a good idea for us to keep an eye on there too.
We'll thread them through or ask at the end, depending how the flow goes. No worries. But before we leave the Warhammer Sandbox, I would be remiss if I did not ask you, Clint, when approaching a shared universe like Warhammer or Warhammer 40K, how different is it to need to write for that universe as opposed to your own work? How much research into the background goes? I know Michael Stackpole had a great discussion the other day that it's much more important to write than know the universe, but knowing the universe probably certainly helps. So how much of that is true for you?
Oh, I think you absolutely have to have not just the fundamentals, but sort of the specifics of whatever facet of the world that you're going to be writing in. At one point, I could probably give you chapter and verse on Warhammer's Old World. You know, I could rattle off, hey, this town in the Empire, this is, why it's important and who was there and all this kind of material. So 40K being a much bigger setting, there was a lot more sort of gray areas that you could kind of get away with doing your own thing. Whereas with the Old World, it was so confined, you really had to know your stuff. Almost along the lines of, writing actual historical fantasy. You can't have the Japanese showing up in the Peloponnesian War, it's just not going to fly. So, yeah, you really have to be true to the setting. At some point, somebody's going to open up Middle Earth, and I really kind of feel for the authors that are going to try and tackle that, because there's another setting where you just have to know all the nuts and bolts to it to actually present it the way it should be presented.
As a certain multi-billion-dollar company is finding out with a truly awful television show, right?
I'm not going to comment on that.
They shall remain nameless. But before moving on to some of your solo work, I do want to ask, we're still talking Warhammer, they've had a truly incredible stable of authors over the years. I know you're friends with William King and Nathan Long, and they're both terrific. You've got, with so much talent over there, how much did the writers work together? I mean, what's it like still being friends with some of these guys years later and seeing them branch out into their own work, be it Nathan Long taking up Fawford and the Grey Mouse, or Jeff Lemire doing his own comic book work?
Well, it was kind of a funny thing when I met William King for the first time at a Adepticon, or sorry, not at Adepticon, it was a Black Library Live in Nottingham. Because I took over the reins of Thanquol from him for a trilogy of novels. And we both kind of had the same experience with that character, where you've also often heard of Robert E. Howard saying it almost felt like Conan was standing behind him dictating the stories. Well, it was almost like Thanquol was in the room chittering his paranoid delusions to me when I was writing that character. And William King had the exact same experience with him, where he would kind of shoehorn his way into novels where he wasn't even in the outline. And it was just fascinating that we both had the same experience with that character. So I have the deepest respect for William King and, kind of what he's brought to fantasy in general. I still, especially the Troll Slayer and Skaven Slayer, I think are two of the best books ever written for Warhammer. Probably with the exception of Drakenfels from Kim Newman. But Nathan Long, I mean, he did very stellar work. I love his Blackhearts, probably a little bit more than some of his other work, just because I think he was given more freedom to explore, different nuances of the Warhammer world with those characters. But I've conversed with Dan Abnett and Nick Vincent, Mike Lee, Joshua Reynolds, and David Annandale. I conversed with quite a bit. David Geimer, which he's almost like a writing machine right now. I kind of envy his output. But yeah, they had a really great stable of authors, and I think a lot of that goes back to Mark Gascon and Christian Dunn in the days of Inferno, because they really had a good knack for spotting people that could deliver the goods.
Something every editor always wants that knack for, trust me. And I guess just because I know I'm fairly new to Warhammer and Warhammer 40k and dove into looking for some of these books because of authors like you and Nathan and the others. For all of our viewers who might not be familiar with your work on Warhammer, where would you like to direct them to get more acquainted with it?
Well, I do the same thing anytime that question pops up for really any setting. I always advise find an anthology with a range of authors, because you're going to get a lot of different perspectives on the world. You're going to get a lot of stories from different areas and aspects of that world. So, for me, Realms of Chaos was one of the first things I picked up from the Black Library era of Warhammer. And that was a lot of stories that were sort of curated from the old box tree era, but they gave a really wide range of different subjects. You had chaos and corruption, and you might have an elf story nestled in between everything. So it's really a good variety. And I know Kings of War, Winged Hussar has a anthology called Edge of the Abyss that kind of serves the same function. Gives you a wide range of different factions and areas of Panathor to delve into.
And we have a great question from Matt Holder. Can you talk about writing for Warhammer across close to 2 decades now, especially with some of the lore changes, editorial changeover, transition into the Age of Sigmar, and how that contributed or detracted or affected your writing process? And how does writing for Games Workshop change or feel different at different times?
Well, I think it really kind of boils down to sort of changing directions on their part. I know when Age of Sigmar was first being rolled out, a lot of stuff was being sort of dictated from the game studio side of things. So you had a very linear scope that you were able to go through. They didn't want you straying from what was actually in the game books. And that made it a little frustrating because, okay, I've got these gigantic chaos armies rampaging everywhere. Who's feeding them? So sometimes questions like that as an author you need to know, but don't really fit into the game setting, and it is just kind of frustrating, kind of banging your head against those sort of barriers. I think back when GW, they used to have a position called the Overfiend for 40K and the Lore Master for Warhammer Fantasy. And they were sort of the default guru for all the lore in that particular setting. I think when they had somebody responsible for that, things ran a little bit smoother because you had sort of a final veto. Almost, if you go back years and years and years ago, when Jim Shooter was editor-in-chief for Marvel, he had this voluminous knowledge of the different comic books and could, point out, hey, you got this character here that showed up in a Marvel 2-in-1 10 years ago, and this is what happened to him, so you can't do that. It kind of helps to have somebody that's, kind of eked out to that degree.
And speaking of sandboxes played in, how challenging was it writing for Marvel?
Well, that was kind of a cheat because I didn't have as big of a scope to write in. So I did 2 books for the Legends of Asgard series through Aconite, The Sword of Surtur and 3 Swords. But because it was pretty much just contained with Asgard and well, in the case of the first book, Muspelheim, it didn't have this huge variety of characters that I had to worry about. It wasn't connected to the greater, Marvel universe with Ultron or Captain America or anybody along those lines. So being confined a little more didn't make it as intimidating of a prospect. And I think that can sometimes be to the detriment of an author where you've got to worry about too many moving parts that don't really affect your story at all. So sort of the narrower scope that you can go with, the better I think the story ends up. Ed brought up a great point in the earlier panel about the personal stakes aspect of sword and sorcery. And I think that can kind of be applied to a lot of fiction, where the narrower the focus, the more intimate the storytelling becomes.
Well, you've written for Games Workshop, you've written for Marvel. Are there any other sandboxes you'd like to take a swing at some point in the future?
Well, I've also written for Zombicide Black Plague. I've done work with Wild West Exodus. I did some stories for Privateer Press with their Iron Kingdoms setting. I'm currently doing some work with Kings of War for Mantic. And let's see, Keyforge, I did one. Kind of a highlight, though, has to be I did a Solomon Kane story that was serialized in Marvel Comics over the course of the 4 issues of Conan Serpent War. So that was a real thrill, being able to actually write sort of a character I grew up with. I would say if there were settings I wanted to mess around with, I'd love to do something with the Shadow. Again, something I can blame on my father. And pretty much give my eye teeth to do something official with Godzilla, as the T-shirt and stuff behind me can testament.
You certainly have had work show up in a bunch of kaiju-themed collections, so let none doubt your love for the giant monsters shines through your work. As does your love for grim, gritty, blood-covered bastards, which I just love. What is it that draws you to creating those kinds of characters?
I think a lot of times, sort of a ruthless character along the lines of Werner or Akurio in my story Hunters and Prey, which is featured in Neither Beg Nor Yield from Rogue Blades. You've really got somebody that can do anything. You're not handicapped by any ideas of, the moral high ground or sort of societal norms. These are people that they're not playing by the rules. So I think that's something that really appeals to a reader. I know it's a good escapist avenue, which Tolkien used to say, that was sort of the prime mission of an author, was to provide escapism for people. It's kind of what frustrates me with, let's update this. No, don't update anything. Let people escape into the story. You can't mess around too much with the expectations of the reader, because it's a cheat. I have written more squeaky clean characters. Really good example in Shadows over Avalon, the second volume. I have a story where I actually wrote Sir Galahad, which I like to say Sir Galahad is the original Mary Sue. He was added late to the Arthurian mythos, and he was deliberately, he's better than Lancelot, he's better than this, he's the purest guy. So taking someone like that and trying to make him approachable was a real challenge, but I think I found the greatest insight into a character like that. Yes, they might be as great and grand as the legends say, but they don't believe that they are. They feel they're, have shortcomings. They aren't enough. And I think that gives a great insight to even somebody like Superman, who can really do pretty much anything, but he's sort of his own critic of, I can't do this, I can't do that, I'm not enough. And I think if you go in with that approach, you can kind of humanize these larger than life characters. I hope that covered the question.
Quite thoroughly, and I love it. So, moving on to your own characters, I want to start with my introduction to your work. Ronin by the name of Shintaro Oba. I know you originally created him for one of the Rogue's Blades anthologies. What inspired the creation of Oba?
Well, I do have to play devil's advocate for Oba himself. He would be infuriated that you called him a Ronin. The term is accurate, absolutely accurate. His clan has been destroyed, but he sees himself as still fulfilling the last mission entrusted to him by his late lord. So from his mindset, he is a samurai, and he gets really angry when he's called a Ronin. But as for inspiration, I mean, Japanese cinema has been something I've delved into pretty much all my life. Obviously growing out of Godzilla, Gamera, Battle of the Planets back in the day, which we never even heard of Gatchaman until many decades later. But once I got into Akira Kurosawa and some of the samurai and swordplay movies, that really opened the door to thinking, I really wish, these are great, but I really wish, some sort of horrible monster would show up. So much later on, I started thinking, well, you could kind of approach Japanese mythology through a sword and sorcery lens. And that's kind of what got me up and running with Shintaro Oba. I actually had a earlier draft for a story long before Rage of the Behemoth from Rogue Blades, which is Oba's first appearance. The character himself dates back, I think, to 2007. And I want to say, Jason can probably correct me, I want to say Rage of the Behemoth was a 2009 release. So kind of a long period that the character germinated.
It was 2009, so that's accurate. And what was it that made you stick with the character across multiple publishers, multiple editors, close to 20 years at this point? What is it that's made you connect with Oba the way you have?
I think a lot of it's almost like a reaction to sort of the underhanded characters I write elsewhere. Because Oba's got sort of a non-personal mindset. It's all about duty and honoring his late lord, trying to accomplish this final mission that was entrusted with him. Whereas, somebody like Werner, it's just strictly, give me the money. Thanquol is constantly scheming to advance his own status within Skaven society, as the Horned Rat intended. Some of my characters that I've written in Age of Sigmar kind of fall into the same mold, where they're kind of working towards their own ends. I would like to mention Lady of Sorrows, because there's something in there that I always wanted to do, but I hadn't really seen done before, was playing with the idea of the Chosen One and what happens when the Chosen One gets taken out. What does everybody else do?
And at least one thing I've always loved about the Shintaro Oba stories is that, to touch on your love of kaiju movies in Kurosawa, you reference a lot of that. There is, of course, all of the various creatures and monsters he faces and fights during his quest. I've caught a couple references to old samurai movies here and there in the stories. And it's probably no small thing that these stories came out at the same time as we've seen stuff like Demon Slayer, Goblin Slayer, and stuff popping up in anime and manga, which is very well timed for Oba, at least.
Well, I think that's more of a Western thing, because fantasy, as far as anime is concerned, has kind of always been with us. Record of Lodoss War is a good example, and I want to say that's late 80s, if not early 90s, that series was produced. Berserk was a very long-running thing, both in the manga and anime. An obscure one that I know influenced quite a bit of stuff was a old, I think there were only 2 episodes, was referred to as Ogre Slayer. And that's a hero that's a half ogre that's hunting down these various Oni in Japan. So it's almost like a mesh of the modern with the feudal. Another old one was Curse of the Undead Yoma, which that's probably mid-90s. So there's kind of been a big fantasy aspect to anime if you knew where to look for it. Demon Slayer, Goblin Slayer, those have been very high-profile things, which I think, with the exception of maybe Berserk, you really haven't seen before within anime circles.
Before I return to Shintaro Oba, I definitely want to ask, you're a big fan of Berserk then, I take it? And by the way, Record of Lodoss War, classic.
I'd call myself more of a dabbler with Berserk. I've watched some of the anime. I've got one volume of the manga, but far from fluent with Berserk, unfortunately.
So with Shintaro Oba, I have to ask, you've done a lot of short fiction. Are there plans to maybe do a collection at some point in the future? Maybe a Shintaro Oba novel?
I've been in discussions with an editor about that. Possibly doing a sort of serialized novel where you kind of Frankenstein the short stories together. I do have outlines for 2 legitimate novels with Oba, but right now, kind of all up in the air. Still beating my head against a Kings of War novel, so I'm trying to get that wrapped up before I advance with anything. Rumor has it I've got a couple of stories coming up from a certain magazine publisher, so you might want to take that away.
Well, I guess let's let that cat out of the bag. I, too, have heard you've made about 2 or 3 sales recently. Would you care to tell us about those?
Well, I believe he has it slated for Anvil, a story called Blood of the Oni, which is actually the very first Shintaro Oba story that I plotted out way back in 2007. And I had it earmarked. I was going to try and get it into the Flashing Swords e-zine back when Howard Andrew Jones was editing it. But other things came up, and the story ended up not getting written until about 4 or 5 years ago. But it does mark the very first appearance of Oba as far as what I did with the character. Like I said, the outline itself predates the story that appeared in Rage at the Behemoth, which was Rotten Bones Rattle. I believe the other story is going to appear in Battleborn, if I'm not mistaken.
Issue number 1, in fact.
Oh, well, there we go. And that one is got a very creepy demon that he's up against. And as Jason can attest with a completely different demon, you shouldn't let somebody that isn't afraid of spiders write about spiders.
Having read the story, he is, if anything, underselling how creepy this monster is. And to give you an idea of what it's like to work with Clint, I approached him seeing if maybe he'd want to turn in a Shintaro Oba story for Battleborn. And with the power and pace of a machine gun, he sends me 3 of them and another story which he'd already submitted to Anvil, which will be in Anvil number 7. I mean, how do you do it? That turnaround time is impressive.
Well, as I said, it's kind of a cheat because 2 of those were already ready. So it was only one that I had to write for the magazine. So to all aspiring writers out there, always hang on to your backlog. Don't delete something just because, this didn't get accepted by so-and-so. Always hang on to them because the right market will come up.
And you've worked with some of the best outlets in modern sword and sorcery. You've worked with Jason Waltz over at Rogue Blades Entertainment. You've worked with Howard Andrew Jones in Tales of the Magician's Skull. You're working with some schmuck named Korsgaard over at Anvil and Battleborn. You've made the leap from your work has been a signature across several publishers, several magazines in modern sword and sorcery. How's that feel?
Feels kind of humbling, to be honest. Tales from the Magician's Skull was a fantastic magazine. I'm really got my fingers crossed that Outland continues the legacy after Goodman turned over the baton to them. Rogue Blades, Jason was publishing the kind of stuff I like to read. So it's nice to appear next to, all these other authors that I enjoy. Kind of daunting to be keeping company with, Adrian Cole, for example. It's kind of, our previous panel was kind of awkward being the guest of honor when Adrian Cole's there. Howard Andrew Jones, his Hanavar stories are top notch. Going back, I'd still make the argument that Warhammer Fantasy, Age of Sigmar, not so much, but Warhammer Fantasy was sword and sorcery. And Inferno, there were just so many great authors in there. Gordon Rennie with his wonderful Savant character. The entire concept of let's do Sherlock Holmes in a fantasy setting was brilliant. John Green, some of his characters were phenomenal. I really wish he'd done more with his Necromancer. Dan Abnett, Nick Vincent, William King. There are just so many great authors that, you get kind of a complex appearing next to them, like, is my stuff really this good? And I think that kind of flips around to something I've always maintained. You can never appreciate your own work. Christopher Lee used to always dismiss a lot of the movies he was in because he couldn't see how just his presence would elevate something from garbage to something worthwhile.
I know completely. I hate nearly every word of what I've wrote, but I think I speak for everyone here when we love what you write. So don't doubt yourself, sir.
Well, that's again very humbling.
Now, before we turn into what I always love to ask writers about their writing routine, their methods, and all that, I do want to scratch that itch that's been starting since you brought up spaghetti westerns. You seem to be a giant fan of some gloriously pulpy material, spaghetti westerns, samurai movies, kaiju flicks, The Shadow. And how much of that has influenced your work? Like, at least from my experience, I've learned more about staging an action scene from Shaw Brothers movies than I have from any writing course. How much of that has helped you as an author, and how much of that shaped your work into what it is today?
Well, I'd say a lot of it. I kind of owe a big debt to Gene Autry. Growing up, he was in control of one of the local TV stations, and they used to always show old monster movies on there. The Universal stuff from AIP. Not so much Hammer. I kind of came late to Hammer, probably I was already in middle school. But I know a lot of those really influenced my kind of love for monsters and the macabre. So, and everything kind of grows out of itself. When I worked at a video store, it really expanded my scope of, getting out of genre films and just exploring pretty much anything that had a cool cover. So, that's how you kind of dip your toes for the first time into film noir and that kind of thing. So I think as an author, you can never be sure what's going to actually influence your writing or what's going to inspire a story. Sometimes it can be just a 5-minute moment in a movie that sparks an idea, or you're reading even just a short story and it occurs to you, well, what if this had happened instead? And then it spirals out from there. I know a lot of times I'll be reading different histories and some just little throwaway facet in there. And it's like, oh, hey, that would be a good idea. So, I think your influences just come from everywhere, and you can never really gauge how much they're going to influence you.
From Jason Ray Carney, how long did you work at a video store? Because that seems like a very cool element of your background, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you if you could recommend one Western, one samurai flick, and one monster movie to our audience. What would they be?
Well, I worked at a Hollywood video for 5 years. Probably the most entertaining job I've ever had. Now, as far as recommendations would go, gonna try and avoid anything people have likely already seen. So for a Western, I would tap The Big Gun Down with Lee Van Cleef and Thomas Milan. Really good spaghetti Western. Samurai movie, again, going for something outside of Kurosawa. Probably Incident at Blood Pass, which has two of my favorite actors, Toshiro Mifune and Shintaro Katsu. Really good, almost like a film noir with samurai. Really underrated film. And monster movie, Rodan. That's my absolute favorite movie of anything.
Can't beat a classic, and you can't beat Toshiro Mifune either. So, for your writing routine, what does that look like in a given day, in a given week? Do you have any special things you do to prepare to get in that headspace? Do you have a word count you aim for each day? Are you a plotter or a pantser?
Oh, I absolutely hate pantsing. I think that's terrible advice for anybody. You don't want to be rigidly locked into your outline. You want to have room for it to breathe. But I find that you have to have that skeleton first. I really ran into that with doing the Thankful books. Because if I didn't have that skeleton, Thankful would have just hijacked the narrative completely, and I would have had massive rewrites. So I think it's essential to have that outline so that you can know where you're going, where you're proceeding. So everything's building towards an end. Certain series that will go unnamed, I think, are having that problem because side plots and things that weren't outlined have been allowed to kind of grow beyond their boundaries, and now it's become too unwieldy. Robert Jordan, actually, I think, had that problem with his Wheel of Time series, where sometimes you'd have these what we used to call door stoppers, these 500-page books, and you get to the end, and it's like, this didn't advance the main story at all. So I think it's really essential, especially when somebody's starting out, you need that outline. In a given day, I usually shoot for a few thousand words. Lately, I've been hitting around 500, which is disheartening. One thing that I always find that helps to get you into that headspace is putting on some kind of a soundscape, and really anything that doesn't have dialogue, that's lyrics that are going to distract you. Lately I've been using a YouTube channel called Rest for the Wicked, and he does a lot of 1 hour chorus soundscapes that are really good.
Do you listen to music while you write?
No, unless it's instrumental. I've had spaghetti Western soundtracks in the background, Hammer horror, even if it could be scores. But anything with lyrics I find can distract me from the writing.
For any new authors or people looking to better hone their work and their writing routines, do you have any advice you'd give them?
Well, one piece of advice, which I think is unfortunate, is I see it a lot where people on public forums will kind of lay their work out there, or they'll ask for insight and stuff. I think that's a mistake. You need to be selective in who you're getting input from, because it's an unfortunate thing that there's a certain mentality out there that has the crabs in the bucket kind of deal, where they, this person might succeed before me, so they got to pull you back down. And I think you have to be very careful who you're taking advice from, to give advice.
So we have another question from our audience. Do you ever see yourself writing a doorstopper?
I would hope not. I think, not as a whole work. I think one of the best things I ever did as a combined element was the Black Plague, which would count as a doorstopper, but it was written as a series of independent novels and short stories. So I think that's a better way to go. It gives somebody something self-contained that's manageable without, having this gigantic... there's a reason few people read the Silmarillion, because it's such a daunting thing to dive into. I know I've made a few abortive attempts when I was a teenager, and kind of my shame, I've read the Cliff Notes version, but I've yet to actually dive into the book itself, which, again, kind of is a point of shame for me.
So before I turn to some closing questions, do our audience have anything they'd like to ask Clint? This one from Jason Ray Carney. There is a scene where the High Priest of Sigmar, who is a poser, realizes that he is not a poser. Do you remember that scene?
Yes, I do. And there's an interesting facet. I'm drawing a blank on the character's name right now, which is terrible. But forgive me, it's several years ago and a lot of books ago. But originally, we had a extended scene of him after he, spoiler alert, after he dives off the Cathedral of Sigmar, and kind of coming to terms with the fact that, his faith wasn't in vain, kind of a deal, and sort of this act of atonement for sort of not necessarily the evil he did, but sort of the evil he permitted to flourish. And I kind of thought that was sort of a defining moment for that character, because up till that point, he'd always been an antagonist. So it really was not so much a redemption, but a penance.
Another question we have you ever heard of Matthew Meyer or the website yokai.com, which covers Japanese mythology?
Yes, I have. Unfortunately, I was late to the party, and his books are now kind of getting beyond my price range. But yes, I love his website. A lot of great obscure Japanese folklore on there.
Because I have to ask, given the nature of this convention, to you, what defines sword and sorcery? What makes it special and unique as a subgenre, and why do you love it?
I think it really comes down to that question of scale again, where in the earlier panel, it brought up personal stakes. And I think that's really kind of what defines it from high fantasy, is everything is boiled down to a more intimate setting. It's not, armies of dragons flying around, commanding these massive armies. Even when that's going on, it still boils down to the individuals. And that, for me, is what makes it more of a visceral setting than something that's more grandiose.
Because we are running up on our time limit here. For all of you folks watching, where can they find you, your work, and anything you'd like to plug or promote?
Well, probably the easiest way to find me is through Facebook. I don't really have a lot of social media, kind of like Adrian Cole along those lines. My work is kind of all over the place. Right now, I'm still working on some Kings of War material. So I've got this is House on Dominion Street, which is a horror anthology from Winged Hussar, which that recently came out. My most recent novel is City of the Undead, which is a Zombicide Black Plague book. And I've been doing quite a bit of work to get them out of here with Sentinel Creatives out of South Africa. So this is Folkloric, which is kind of a folk horror anthology, and The Devil May Take You, which is a medieval horror anthology. So it's got appearances in both of those.
Well, I say this as a fan, an editor, and lover of sword and sorcery. Wherever you go next, sir, we will follow and love every step of the journey.
The next appearance is Anvil and Battleborn.
There's the plug. I love it. Clint, thank you for your time and a spectacular interview.
Well, thank you, Sean.